Crystal Green, Director of Research at HundrED. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So thank you so much for coming to the show. And we are now in Jyväskylä, and maybe you can talk about why you came to Jyväskylä and starting maybe from the time when you were yourself a student doing initial research, which is a fascinating beginning to your path to Finland.
Yeah, so my husband and I came to Jyväskylä in 2010, and we came here actually for him to study. There's the sport faculty is here in Jyväskylä. I think it's the only sport faculty at any university in Finland. And so we came here for him to study sport and exercise psychology for his master's, and when we got here, we immediately loved it. We had been told by the woman who was the director of the program that Jyväskylä was like the Athens of Finland, so that intrigued us, and we came here for him to study, and then we loved it, and then we stayed for me to study. So I applied to do my PhD in education pretty much right as soon as we got here, and then we just stayed. We thought it was amazing. In 2010, yeah, and then I started my PhD studies in the beginning of 2011. And then it took me a really long time to finish. I didn't finish until 2019, and in the middle I had 4 kids and 4 maternity leaves. But then I managed to finish in 2019, and I did my postdoc in California, and then we came back here to Finland to settle.
And when did you settle here?
We actually immigrated to Finland in 2017, so we knew pretty much as soon as we arrived. We came to Finland from China by train on the Trans-Siberian Express, and when we arrived to Jyväskylä on the train after that experience, and when we got off, within the first 3 weeks of being here, we were like, this is it. This is the place that we want to stay forever. So we actually applied at that point to stay, and they were like, you've only been here a couple weeks, so I don't think so. And it was funny because then when we actually ended up that we did stay, they made our application retroactive to the first time that we had applied, which was really great for them, the Kell inclusion at that time. But we right away started trying to learn the language and to pass the language test that you have to take to get citizenship, and then we got citizenship in 2017. So we already had 3 kids, and then our youngest was born a Finnish citizen.
Wow. So let's dig deeper into that a little bit. So before we go into education, because the purpose of education is of course to have proactive children taking part in the society in productive and healthy ways, and the role of a mother and a father taking care of children is very much underplayed in societies, in modern societies, and we might separate that too much when we talk about education and the role of actually parenting or having even children. Like Finland has a problem now of not having enough children in our fantastic education system. So the role of a mother, can you tell us a little bit how it was to become a mother in Finland, and if you take the mother's perspective raising children in Finland, maybe that was one of the reasons also why you came to Finland. Tell us more about those reasons and focusing on the mother's role.
Yeah, so actually I think when we came here to Finland in 2010, our initial plan had been that we would stay here for 2 years for my husband to do his master's, and then I wanted to apply to this PhD program in Spain, in Barcelona, that I don't think exists anymore, but it was this program in citizenship and values education, because that, for me, that's a passion, the relationship between education and democratic citizenship, and what is education for society and social change. And but when we got to Finland, right away I thought, this would be a lovely place to have kids. This would be a really fantastic place to raise children. And my husband and I, we both grew up in the Midwest in the United States in monolingual families. So for us it was a big thing to we lived in Chile together and to learn how to speak Spanish, and then we lived in Japan and to learn how to speak Japanese, even just to get by and have conversations and integrate into society. And we wanted that to be a little bit easier for our kids if they would grow up with a second language and not have to, as an adult, basically start trying to learn a second language. or third or fourth. So we had always had this aspiration that we would raise our children somewhere where the language wasn't English. So that coming to Finland, it kind of like ticked that box, but then also like Finland is just such a wonderful place. There's so much social support for raising kids. The like maternity box is kind of famous worldwide. But I think for me as a woman who also had career aspirations, and I wanted to get my PhD and I wanted to continue in my career, I still think that for most women in the United States, it's very difficult to have both. It's very difficult to have a career and also have kids, especially like 4 kids. Like it's really difficult. And partially it's difficult because of partially because of the expectations. There was an American man who said to me when I was pregnant with my first, like, oh, are you going to quit your PhD now? But here in Finland, I had 3 women supervisors. All of my supervisors were women. All of them were mothers. They had all had kids, and it was like they were very supportive, and it was never a question about like, oh, are you done now? I don't think you're going to do this anymore because you also want to be a mom. So I felt like professionally and also from the system, I had a lot of support to like be a mom, but then also have a career, and I think that was really important for me. And I think that one of the other things I really appreciate about Finland is just the trust that you can have in the system. They're very attentive to every single child and every single child's situation, their home situation, how are they behaving at home, how are they behaving at school, what does this child need? And that level of attentiveness to like every single child's learning and path is something that like in some countries it's just not even possible because there's so many kids and so few teachers, and even in places where the student-to-teacher ratio is feasible that it might be able to do that, just the way that the system is set up and the kind of supports that teachers have to attend to every child and their own learning path is just very different. So I feel like it's more, when I go into our parent-teacher meetings here, it's a dialogue. It's not just a tick-the-box exercise. They're curious about my kid, and I feel like we can have a rapport and a conversation and a dialogue. And I think that like as a mom, I have appreciated so much the trust that I'm able to have in the system here. It is not perfect, and I know that like you could go around and find 10 Finns that said I had a terrible time in school and I didn't like it at all. No place is perfect, but I think that our experience here has been really awesome.
Fantastic. And you've been in Jyväskylä all your time
in Finland.
Here in Finland?
Yeah, and so sometimes I wonder, like, is it Finland that I love, or is it just Jyväskylä that I love? Like,
yeah, I mean, let me tell you that I have family in Rauma, and I've spent basically my childhood around that area, and now we live in the capital region. And for us today, coming up here, we haven't been in Jyväskylä. We've been in the larger cities. We've been up to Oulu, Rovaniemi. But coming here now driving, we were like amazed about the forests everywhere, like just green forests and trees everywhere. So it's different. It's different from maybe more capital cities of Finland. But I'm going to learn more about Jyväskylä today and tomorrow. So I'm curious to see more and learn more and to see how different it is really. But you can tell me more about that also if you want to, but let's go a little bit back to your education interest. So before you actually almost decided to go to Barcelona to study, you had an interest in what you wanted to study and research. And how did that come about? And you were also in Latin America doing research or studies before that. Tell us more about that. We have a Latin American community, so very interested in that as well.
I don't know like how far to go back to tell this story, but basically
start from your first exposure to the Spanish language.
The Spanish language, that's a little bit of a different story. I was gonna like for education, it was my mom was a teacher and her mom was a teacher.
Okay,
and my like so that we had it in the family, but then for Spanish, my mother's father, my grandfather, he was named Buena. But they called him Buna. It's pronounced in this English way. And when he retired, he was a lawyer, and when he retired, he just got very fascinated about Spanish, and he decided that he wanted to like learn Spanish because I don't know. He just did, and he had this. Maybe because his name was Buen, they called him Buna. But when I was a kid, he would have all these books everywhere. He had like Reader's Digest, Spanish and English, and all these dictionaries. And so when I would go over to their house, I always saw these like multilingual books and his own passion, his own interest as a retiree to try to learn Spanish. So that was really my first experience with Spanish, and his own like desire to kind of learn from not knowing any other language, of being a completely monolingual, community. And then, like, I think taking his cue, my mom also studied Spanish in school, and so she had kind of like learned some in high school. And then I was just like, in high school, I was really obsessed and passionate about languages. Like I wanted maybe something that I was really good at, maybe, just like better at than anybody else. And all the people in my high school class were brilliant and amazing and did everything that I could do but better. So Spanish became kind of a thing for me, where I was like, this is going to be my thing. And I loved it, and I loved the language. And then I went on an exchange program in Ciudad Real in Spain for a summer when I was 17, and it was like a complete immersion, and I really loved that experience. And then after that I went to college, and I spent like a couple of years. I thought I was going to be a Spanish major.
Okay, but tell us about the experience, the first experience in Spain, the immersion. What role do you think that played in your future life and education? We're very much promoting international exchange for students in our countries here, in the Nordics. We speak a few languages, so we know that our language, our culture, our country is too small to, let's say, do anything by itself. So we know that the international experience is very important. And what role did it play for you as a 17-year-old?
It was a phenomenal experience, and I would really recommend anybody to do it. It was difficult too. Of course, the first couple of weeks, we're young, we're 17, we're kind of like thrown into this situation with a bunch of other 17-year-olds who've never met before and told you're not allowed to speak to each other in anything but Spanish. So like the communication was there. And then we also had host families, like very generous people who like invited these young folks into their home, and the communication didn't always go well. But I think that for me, that feeling of learning who I could be in another language, like what options there were for me to express myself differently in a different something more than language, like a different cadence, a different register. Also, like people told me that when I speak Spanish, my voice is lower. I feel somehow like I express a different kind of being myself when I speak in Spanish, and it's really exciting. But I also remember I was on the bus one day, and I had this experience where I had kind of forgotten some basic word, and I just couldn't pull it to mind, like what I was feeling. I just couldn't remember the word in English, but I also didn't know the word in Spanish. So I was just left there sitting with this wordless feeling, and it was a really amazing experience to think about what is the world like then without language, if you can't remember how to express yourself, but you also don't know what the other words would be that would communicate to someone. Like I found that a very powerful experience, and to realize like the relationship between our embodied experience and how it is that we use language to make sense of the world, and like what do we do when we don't have that, when we don't have the words to communicate. So I don't know, I feel like that probably then translated into my other interests later in research of like what is like constructivism, or like understanding different ontological representations of the world when we think about the relationship between language and meaning.
Yeah, and then how did that take you further in your own studies and your development?
So that was when I first started studying Spanish, and then after that I went to college, and I ended up, instead of studying Spanish, I ended up studying history. And then some of the classes I took were in Latin American history, and I became very fascinated with that. And so then I went through this. I didn't know what I knew from the time I was 16 that I wanted to get my PhD, but I just didn't know what in. Like I didn't know what I was going to. It was going to be ethnomusicology for a while, then Spanish, and then I thought I was going to do Latin American history, and then. So then after I graduated from university with this bachelor's degree in history, I got a teaching certification to teach English as a second language, this TOEFL certification, this master's certification from Indiana State University. And then I applied for a Fulbright scholarship to go to Chile. And it was one of these scholarships where there was a research piece and then there was a teaching piece. So I was placed at the Language Institute at the University of Atacama. And my husband and I went there. We were there for an academic year. And it was there that things started to shift for me, because I thought that was going to do this history research. I was there and I wanted to understand the impressions that people in Chile had of the U.S. involvement in the coup. But when I got there, my very naive, not at all trained in qualitative research bachelor's self, I realized very quickly that, first of all, people didn't really want to talk about it. Second of all, to the extent that they did want to talk about it, their impressions were more about the local politics and their local experience more than having anything to do with the U.S. involvement. And then at the university where I was, there wasn't a history department. There were very few books that went, past 1960 in the library, and I really started thinking okay, but then here I want to come back to the United States and teach Latin American history to young American U.S. undergrads. But what about here? In Chile, people are not even having the opportunity to study their own history. This is not being taught or discussed, and it's a huge pain point. But then what is then the relationship between education and society? And I had a really powerful interaction with the man who was the director of the institute. We were doing, so the institute was for teacher training and for translation. So training people who were going to be translators and training people who were going to be teachers locally, English teachers. And we were doing a curriculum reform the year that I was there, and so we're having all these meetings about how to.
And when was this?
At the University of Atacama.
And when? What year?
2006. So it was a really interesting year to be there, because Bachelet was president, and it was the year of the Los Pingüinos, the student protests that they had all over Chile. So for the first couple months that we were there, everyone was on strike. But it was really amazing, because really young people were striking in Chile, and there's such a rich history of protest in that country, and lots of very interesting dynamics that were not present for me as a university student in the United States. The idea that, at least at that time, it's different now. You see university students protesting now about the war in Palestine, but then you didn't, in Gaza. But when I was in university, I don't know, the people were really up in arms about anything in particular. So that was a really powerful experience for me, to be there while they were protesting, and to think about okay, but then what are we teaching? And I was asking the director, what do you want our students to learn as we're doing this curricular reform? And he said they should learn we want them to learn about democracy, so that what happened with Allende and Pinochet never happens again. And that really got me thinking okay, but how do you do that then? What does that mean for university studies, for teachers, for pre-service teachers, to learn about democracy and what democracy means? And then from there, we went to Japan.
So how did your experience in Chile, let's say, form your decisions forward? Let's also talk about your interests. How did they develop towards then focusing on education, research, and so on?
I think it was in Chile that I came to understood that without education, there's no history. Right? We have to teach the history. We have to tell the history, and that the primary place that happens for most people is in school. Right? There are many other places. There's media, there's stories that you hear as an adult, and of course, we're always learning. But I think that some of those basic kind of building blocks of what is our shared story, what is the story of the nation. We think about citizenship education of who are we, what is our past, what is our shared past, and how do we make sense of how it is that we as a nation got here, and this place sort of like came to be politically and socially. So I think that was something that was impressed on me. But then also it was in Chile for the first time that I met a woman who introduced me to the work of Paulo Freire. And so I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed for the first time, and that really like blew my mind, because I realized how my own education had been shaped, and also what it was some of the things I was doing at the university and the way that I was approaching things myself. Like, it really made me understand like, again, like the role of education in society and how it is that these power dynamics play out, and how do we understand the agency really of people as they learn things, that like people come to the classroom with their own story also, right? It's not just that we learn a shared story of the nation. We also come with our own stories, and we try to think like, how does my life fit into this? And you know.
And then to Japan, and through Japan to Finland.
Yes.
Tell us that story.
Yeah, so my husband and I really enjoyed teaching English in Chile. We thought that was really fun. And I was also really curious, thinking about this question about democracy, to go somewhere else where it was also a democratic country, but the way that they had come to democracy was very different, right? So, and then to think about, like, for example, like what does education for democracy mean in Japan? How do we understand that relationship, or how are the teachers there making sense of that? So I was very curious to understand that. And I had also studied Japanese for a couple semesters in college as part of this like Asian conversations kind of minor that I did. So, and then my husband's like a huge anime fan anyway, so like all these things kind of came together. So we went to Japan, we lived there for 2 years, we taught at high schools English. It was also an amazing and mind-bending experience to live there, and I hope that at some point we'd have a chance to go back. I learned a lot there, and then I think that for me, like the thing that I took from that experience was really more about like how it is that teachers work together. That I think coming from Chile, where there's like, my experience was that there's a lot of balkanization between the faculty. People are very hesitant to share with each other. It feels like even knowledge is a scarce resource, in the sense that people want to hold their own information and their own materials. And like, at least at the university where I was, there wasn't really a collaborative culture of sharing. And I think there are probably a lot of like personal and political and historical reasons for those dynamics, but I also don't think that that's necessarily, I think that it's more like the political environment creates the conditions that then from that emerge from really wonderful and lovely people otherwise, like dynamics where they feel like they need to protect themselves, or else they might be out of a job, or like those kinds of things. But then when I was working in Japan, like there's such, at least at the school that I was in, there were such like routinized ways of working together as a collaborative in ways that I had never experienced before, in ways that are more like stepping back to balance the power rather than like engaging again and again. And so then I became very fascinated with that piece of like, how does agency manifest in the collective? How do we come together to make decisions and to make change? And how do we collaborate? What does collaboration really look like? What is the relationship between like learning and collaboration as a social phenomenon that's happening in the schools, and the kind of how it is that then leads to the like sustainment or change in this system in Japan for like schools as they provide education to children. And then I went from there back to the States, and then I did my master's in international education policy. And then it was from there that we went to China and then to Finland.
Okay, so education policy is also very relevant and important right now.
Yeah.
There's many topics related to technology we can talk about, but also principles that we need to maybe take into account. But let's go then to your story in Finland. You're as a researcher, through your time as a researcher, finishing your PhD, and also through your present role at HundrED.